The humidity of the San Francisco morning hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and the salty tang of the bay. Outside the polished mahogany doors of the Jade Pavilion, the world was divided into two distinct realities. Inside, the elite dined on dim sum served on bone china. Outside, Julian Vance stood on the cold concrete, feeling the vibration of the city through the thin soles of his worn-out sneakers. He adjusted the tattered hood of his sweatshirt, pulling it lower to shield his eyes from the glare of the rising sun. In his calloused hands, he held a piece of cardboard with jagged edges. The words, "Anything helps," were scrawled in fading black marker, a simple plea that most people treated like an invisible wall. The morning rush was a blur of expensive wool coats and the rhythmic clicking of Italian leather shoes. To the bankers and tech moguls hurrying toward their glass towers, Julian was just a smudge on the landscape, a glitch in their perfect metropolitan aesthetic. He watched them with a quiet, observant intensity, his gaze far steadier than any man in his position should have. He wasn't begging for coins so much as he was witnessing the world from the bottom up. Every sneer and every averted glance was a data point in a study of human nature that his late wife had understood far better than he ever had. The peace of his silent observation was shattered by the sharp creak of the restaurant's heavy doors. Mr. Chen stepped onto the sidewalk, looking like a man who had never known a day of physical labor in his life. His silk tie was knotted with mathematical precision, and his gold cufflinks glinted aggressively in the light. Chen took a deep breath of the morning air, but his face soured the moment his eyes landed on Julian. He didn't just see a man in need, he saw an infestation. Chen began to polish his cufflinks with a silk handkerchief, his movements slow and deliberate, dripping with a sense of unearned superiority. "Are you still here?" Chen's voice sliced through the ambient noise of the traffic, sharp and high-pitched with irritation. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked toward Julian, his expensive shoes crunching on the grit of the sidewalk as if he feared the very ground Julian stood on was contagious. "I have people coming here from the mayor's office today. Important people. People who contribute to society. And what do they see when they arrive? They see this. They see you." Julian didn't flinch. He slowly looked up, meeting Chen's gaze. "It's a public sidewalk, sir. I'm not bothering anyone." Chen let out a harsh, jagged laugh that contained no humor. "Not bothering anyone? Your very presence is lowering the property value of this entire block. You're ruining the appetite of my clientele before they even step through the door. Look at you. You're a stain on the reputation I've spent a decade building." Chen turned back toward the restaurant and snapped his fingers sharply. "Sarah, get out here now." A young woman with tired eyes and a neatly pressed uniform hurried out, clutching a notepad. This was Sarah, Chen's assistant, who looked as though she wanted to disappear into the brickwork. "Yes, Mr. Chen," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Call the police. Tell them we have a vagrant trespassing and harassing customers," Chen barked, not even looking at her. He was too busy staring at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "And tell them to hurry. I want this trash swept off my walk before the lunch rush." "But sir," Sarah started, her eyes darting toward Julian with a flicker of genuine sympathy, "he's just standing there." "He hasn't actually. I don't pay you to have opinions, Sarah. I pay you to follow orders," Chen snapped, his face reddening. He turned back to Julian, his lip curling into a snarl. "Do you think you're special? Do you think the world owes you a living just because you've given up? People like you are the reason this city is rotting from the inside out. You're a parasite." In a sudden, violent movement, Chen reached out and snatched the cardboard sign from Julian's hands. Julian's grip tightened for a fraction of a second, but he forced himself to let go, his knuckles white. Chen didn't just take the sign, he relished the act of destruction. He gripped the cardboard with both hands and ripped it down the middle, the sound of tearing fiber loud in the sudden silence of the doorway. He then crumpled the pieces into a ball and tossed them into an oily puddle near the gutter. "There," Chen said, smoothing his suit jacket with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "Now you have nothing to hold onto. Move along, or I'll make sure the officers give you a very long place to stay tonight." Julian looked down at his ruined sign floating in the dirty water, then back up at the man standing in the doorway of the Michelin-starred empire. A cold, hard light entered Julian's eyes, a shadow of the man who had once brought entire boards of directors to their knees with a single sentence. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that seemed to vibrate in Chen's very bones. "You should be very careful which bridges you choose to burn, Mr. Chen," Julian said, his tone eerily calm and devoid of the fear Chen expected. "Especially when you don't even own the land those bridges are built on." Chen's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but his arrogance was a thick shield. He scoffed, adjusting his lapels as he prepared to retreat back into the safety of his luxury. "Whatever helps you sleep on the concrete at night, beggar. Just make sure you're gone before I come back out." He turned his back, oblivious to the fact that the man he had just humiliated was the only reason he had a door to walk through at all. The hum of the city street faded away, replaced by the sterile, pressurized silence of a Manhattan boardroom 5 years in the past. In this world, Julian Vance didn't wear a stained hoodie, he wore power like a second skin. He sat at the head of a polished obsidian table that reflected the shimmering skyline of New York City through floor-to-ceiling windows. As the ghost of Wall Street, Julian was a myth, a man whose signature could move markets but whose face rarely graced the covers of magazines. He watched through steepled fingers as a younger, visibly sweating Mr. Chen stood at the far end of the table. Back then, Chen didn't have gold cufflinks or a sneer. He had a frantic dream and a business plan for a restaurant called the Jade Pavilion, and he was failing to convince every other investor in the room. Julian remembered the way the other board members had looked at Chen, with a cold, calculated indifference that bordered on cruelty. They saw a man with no collateral and an unproven concept. But Julian had seen something else. He saw the fire in the immigrant's eyes, the desperation of someone who had traveled halfway across the world to build a legacy. When the room went quiet and the lead investor prepared to show Chen the door, Julian had leaned forward. Without saying a word to Chen directly, he scribbled a number on a memo pad. $2 million. It was the seed money that would build the very empire Chen now used as a pedestal for his arrogance. Julian hadn't done it for the profit, he had done it because he believed in the American dream. The memory shifted, turning darker and more intimate. The high-stakes boardroom dissolved into the soft, rhythmic beeping of a hospital monitor 3 months ago. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint fragrance of lavender, his wife's favorite. Elena had been the soul of their family, the one who reminded Julian that their billions were just numbers if they weren't used to serve others. Even in her final days, weakened by the illness that was taking her, she spent her energy organizing food drives and speaking about the invisible people who lived on the margins of society. Julian held her hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and the fading pulse, as she whispered her final wish. She didn't ask for a monument or a wing in a museum. She asked him to truly see the people she loved. She challenged him to walk a mile in the shoes of the forgotten, to understand the weight of the world from the perspective of someone with nothing. The day Elena passed, Julian made a vow. He would leave the penthouses and the private jets behind for 90 days. He would live on the streets, not as a tourist, but as a man seeking the truth his wealth had blinded him to. He placed his entire empire into a blind trust and walked out of his mansion with nothing but the clothes on his back and a cardboard sign. He wanted to see who would offer a hand and who would bring down the hammer. The cold snap of the San Francisco wind dragged Julian back to the present, the transition as jarring as a slap to the face. He was back on the sidewalk, looking at the man he had once bankrolled. The transformation in Chen was staggering. Success had acted like a slow-acting poison, curdling his ambition into a toxic brand of elitism. Chen wasn't just successful now, he was a gatekeeper who had forgotten he was once the one knocking on the door. Standing next to Chen was Mrs. Sterling, the neighborhood's self-appointed moral guardian. She was the kind of woman who wore her entitlement like a badge of honor, her designer handbag clutched to her chest as if Julian might steal her soul just by looking at her. She pulled out her latest model smartphone, the lens reflecting Julian's tired face. She didn't see a human being in mourning, she saw content for her social media feed, a way to show her followers how she was cleaning up the neighborhood. "It's just unbelievable," Mrs. Sterling said. her voice a sharp, nasal whine that set Julian's teeth on edge. I pay $5,000 a month in property taxes just to have to walk past this every morning. Do you have any idea how unsafe this makes the children feel, Mr. Chen? She didn't wait for him to respond before turning her camera toward Julian, her eyes full of a performative outrage. You should be ashamed of yourself, pretending to be poor while hardworking people like us provide for this city. I bet you have a car parked around the block, don't you? You're probably one of those professional scammers we see on the news. Chen chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound as he played to his audience. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Sterling. It's an act. They're all actors. They choose this because it's easier than getting a job. He looked at Julian, his eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. But the show is over. I've built a wall of success that people like you can't climb over. You're a relic of a world I've outgrown. Julian felt the weight of his hidden truth pressing against his chest, a roaring fire he had to keep contained. He looked at Chen, then at the camera lens of Mrs. Sterling's phone. They were so certain of their world, so convinced that their bank accounts gave them the right to judge the soul of another. They had no idea that the man they were recording was the same man who owned the very ground beneath their expensive heels. The tension in the air was thick, a storm cloud waiting for a spark, as Julian realized that his lesson was no longer just for himself. It was for them. The sky over the financial district had turned a bruised, heavy gray, reflecting the cold hostility radiating from the entrance of the Jade Pavilion. Mr. Chen was no longer content with mere words. He wanted a spectacle of humiliation. He signaled to Mark, the head chef, who emerged from the kitchen side door carrying a heavy industrial bucket. The water inside was a murky, gray soup of grease, chemical floor cleaner, and debris from the morning's kitchen scrub. With a jagged, cruel smirk, Chen nodded toward the sidewalk where Julian sat. Without a word of warning, Mark swung the bucket. The rancid water hit the concrete with a heavy slap, splashing over Julian's worn sneakers and soaking the hem of his tattered jeans. The smell of bleach and old food scraps rose instantly in the air. Julian didn't jump or cry out. He simply closed his eyes as the cold, chemical-laden mist settled on his skin. Behind him, Mrs. Sterling let out a sharp, mocking titter, recording the scene with her phone held high. "Oh, careful now," she sneered, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "You wouldn't want to get your designer rags dirty. Though honestly, a bath is probably exactly what you need. You're a walking health hazard." Chen crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at the wet pavement as if he had just performed a civic duty. "Clean the street, Mark. Every inch. We need to wash away the stench of failure before our real guests arrive." As Mark turned to go back inside, Sarah, the assistant, stepped forward. Her face was a mask of quiet horror. She looked at Julian, seeing not a beggar, but a man being treated with less dignity than a stray dog. When Chen turned his head to laugh at something Mrs. Sterling said, Sarah moved with frantic, silent speed. She reached into her apron and pulled out a clean, dry white towel, pressing it into Julian's hand. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "I have to stay. My mom is sick, and I need the insurance. Please, just don't tell him." Julian looked up, his eyes softening for the first time that morning. He gave her a small, imperceptible nod of gratitude before she hurried away, fearing the wrath of her employer. But the cruelty wasn't finished. Mark the chef returned, but this time his hands weren't empty. He carried an expensive, dust-covered bottle of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, a centerpiece from the restaurant's private cellar worth thousands. While Chen kept Julian distracted with a barrage of insults about American entitlement and lazy lifestyles, Mark moved behind Julian's discarded backpack. With the practiced stealth of a thief, he slipped the bottle into the side pocket of the tattered bag. "You know," Chen said, leaning down so his face was inches from Julian's, "I think I've been too patient. I think you're not just a nuisance. I think you're a criminal." He suddenly reached down and grabbed Julian's backpack, swinging it into the air. "What do we have here? My God, Mark, isn't this the bottle that went missing from the display case this morning?" Mark acted his part perfectly, gasping in feigned shock. "That's it. I knew it. I saw him lurking near the delivery entrance earlier. He's a thief. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, the energy shifting from passive observation to active hostility. I knew he looked shady, a man in a business suit muttered, shaking his head. Typical, another added. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one questioned how a man sitting on the sidewalk all morning could have bypassed the restaurant's high-tech security to steal a vintage wine. They saw the rags, they saw the bottle, and they made their verdict. The arrival of the police was marked by the sharp, rhythmic chirp of a siren and the flashing of red and blue lights against the glass of the pavilion. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions guarded. Chen was on them instantly, his voice high and frantic, playing the role of the victimized business owner to perfection. He stole it right out of the cellar. My assistant saw him. He's been harassing my customers and now he's robbing us blind. Julian felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snap around his wrists. The metal was biting and unforgiving, a physical manifestation of the injustice he was enduring. As the officers hoisted him up, the crowd began to jeer. Mrs. Sterling was right there in the front row, her phone inches from Julian's face as he was led toward the patrol car. Going to jail where you belong. She shouted. Maybe they'll give you a shower there. Julian remained silent as he was pushed into the back of the cruiser. The interior smelled of old upholstery and stagnant air. Through the reinforced glass, he saw Chen standing on the steps of his restaurant, shaking hands with the officers, looking like a hero who had successfully defended his kingdom. Chen's eyes met Julian's through the window one last time. He gave a mocking wave, a smirk of absolute victory plastered across his face. Julian didn't look away. Instead, he allowed a very small, very cold smile to touch his lips. He watched the grand reopening banner flutter in the wind above Chen's head. He knew something Chen didn't. That banner was attached to a building that, as of midnight, Chen no longer had the right to stand in. As the car pulled away, Julian leaned his head back against the seat. The breaking point had been reached, and the game was no longer about observation. It was about the reckoning. The holding cell at the precinct was a symphony of misery, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant clanging of iron bars, and the smell of stale coffee and industrial-grade disinfectant. Julian Vance sat on a hard wooden bench, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. To anyone looking through the small observation window, he was just another statistic, a broken man caught in the revolving door of the legal system. But inside, Julian was as calm as the center of a hurricane. He watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking forward with relentless precision. He wasn't waiting for a miracle, he was waiting for the clock to strike a specific hour. The door to the intake room swung open with a heavy thud, but it wasn't a weary public defender who walked through. Instead, a man in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Mr. Chen's car stepped into the room, followed by 2 assistants carrying leather portfolios. This was Marcus Thorne, the senior partner of Vance & Associates, a man whose presence in a police station usually meant someone very powerful was about to have a very bad day. The officer guarding the door stood up straighter, confused by the sudden arrival of legal royalty in the middle of a petty theft processing. Mr. Vance, Marcus said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying a weight of authority that silenced the room. He didn't look at Julian with pity. He looked at him with the profound respect one gives to a commanding officer. The paperwork has been filed. The theft charges are being moved to a special hearing. We've also secured the footage from your wearable device. Julian looked up, and for the first time in 90 days, the tired, weary mask of the beggar fell away. His posture shifted, his shoulders squaring, his gaze turning sharp and predatory. And the lease, Marcus? Tell me about the lease. Marcus opened a portfolio and pulled out a gold-stamped document. Exactly as you suspected, sir. Mr. Chen's lease for the Jade Pavilion, along with every other commercial space in that 3-block radius, expired at midnight. He missed the renewal window by 48 hours because he was too busy planning his elite gala. Technically, he is currently trespassing on your property. Julian stood up, the movement fluid and powerful. The handcuffs, which had felt like shackles of shame an hour ago, now felt like a temporary costume he was ready to shed. He wants to play the victim of a crime? Julian whispered, a cold, dangerous light dancing in his eyes. Let him. We aren't bailing me out yet, Marcus. I want the public hearing. I want the cameras there. I want the world to see the video of Mr. Chen and his chef planting that bottle in a beggar's bag. But more importantly, I want to be back on that sidewalk for his grand reopening. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes that the man he treated like trash doesn't just own the restaurant. He owns the ground it stands on. Julian's mindset had shifted entirely. He was no longer a man mourning in silence or a victim of a cruel businessman. He was a master strategist who had just discovered the ultimate piece of leverage. He decided right then to play the long game. Instead of reacting with the righteous anger he felt, he would embrace the persona of the broken man for just a few more hours. He would let Chen believe he had won. He would let the Karen neighbor, Mrs. Sterling, post her videos and gather her likes. The higher they built their pedestal of arrogance, the harder they would fall when he finally pulled the rug out from under them. Leave me here for the afternoon, Julian instructed, his voice now commanding and cold. Let the word get back to Chen that I'm being prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Let him celebrate. Let him think he's finally rid of the stain on his sidewalk. I want him to feel like the king of the city tonight. Because tomorrow, he won't even be a footnote. Marcus nodded, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. He knew Julian's undercover mission was about empathy, but he also knew that Julian Vance was never a man to let an injustice go unpunished. As Marcus turned to leave, Julian sat back down on the hard bench, closing his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the cold or the grime anymore. He was visualizing the gala, the lights, the champagne, and the moment the mask would finally come off. The hunter was no longer the prey, he was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The following 48 hours were a masterclass in invisible warfare. To the world, Julian Vance had simply vanished back into the gray shadows of the city's underbelly after his release from the precinct. To Mr. Chen, the absence of the beggar was a victory lap. Inside the plush, velvet-walled office of the Jade Pavilion, Chen was in high spirits, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch while he barked orders at his staff. He spent the afternoon mocking the trash he had successfully swept away, laughing with Mark the chef about how easy it had been to frame a man that society had already prejudged. Chen was so blinded by the glare of his own ego that he didn't notice the silent machinery of the real world beginning to grind against him. While Chen was busy picking out gold leaf centerpieces for his gala, Julian was sitting in the back of a blacked-out SUV parked 3 blocks away. The tattered hoodie was still there, but the man inside it was vibrating with a cold, calculated energy. On a secure laptop, he watched a live feed of his own property. He wasn't just watching Chen, he was listening to the shop owners from the neighboring blocks, the florist, the tailor, and the small cafe owner, all of whom had been bullied by Chen's aggressive expansion tactics. One by one, Julian's legal team met with them, offering them the one thing Chen had always denied them: a fair seat at the table. Julian was buying back the soul of the neighborhood, one signature at a time. The cruelty inside the restaurant, however, hadn't ceased just because Julian was gone. Sarah, the loyal assistant who had dared to show Julian a moment of mercy with a dry towel, was currently standing in front of Chen's desk. Her hands were trembling. Chen didn't even look up from his guest list as he spoke, his voice dripping with a casual, devastating malice. I saw the security footage from 2 days ago, Sarah. I saw you handing that animal a towel. You clearly don't understand the brand I'm building here. We don't cater to filth, and we certainly don't comfort it. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and dead. You're fired. Get your things and be out in 5 minutes. And don't bother asking for a reference. I'll make sure no one in this district touches your resume. Sarah walked out of the restaurant into the drizzling rain, her eyes red and puffy, clutching a small box of her belongings. She felt the weight of the world collapsing. Her mother's medication was expensive, and the insurance was now gone. She sat on a park bench nearby, burying her face in her hands. She didn't notice the beggar from the sidewalk approaching until he sat down at the other end of the bench. Julian didn't look at her directly, he kept his gaze on the pigeons. He thinks he's won, doesn't he? Julian said softly. Sarah flinched, recognizing the voice but surprised by the steady, commanding tone. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain white business card. There was no name on it, only a phone number and a gold-embossed logo. Call this number tomorrow morning at 9. Ask for Marcus. Tell him you're the new operations manager for the Vance Hospitality Group. They're opening a new community kitchen and a flagship restaurant nearby. They need someone who knows how to treat people with dignity. Sarah looked at the card, then at the man in the dirty hoodie. She didn't understand, but for the first time in weeks, the crushing weight in her chest lightened. Who are you? She whispered. Julian simply stood up, the rain sliding off his hood. Just a man who appreciates a dry towel, he said, before disappearing into the mist. As the night of the gala approached, Chen was in a state of euphoria. He had ignored the minor red flags, the cryptic notice about his liquor license being under review, the fact that his building manager wasn't returning his calls, and the strange quiet from his usually chatty suppliers. He assumed his connections and his wealth made him untouchable. He stood on the balcony of his restaurant, looking down at the street where he had humiliated Julian, feeling like a god looking down on insects. He had no idea that every phone call he made was being logged, every health violation he had ever bribed his way out of was being documented, and every guest he had invited to his elite night was about to witness the most expensive mistake of his life. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the hunter was finally ready to step into the light. The air inside the Jade Pavilion was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying, metallic tang of cold ambition. It was the night of the elite gala, and Mr. Chen moved through the crowded ballroom like a king surveying his loyal subjects. Crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering glow over the city's power players, their laughter tinkling like ice against glass. Chen straightened his velvet tuxedo jacket, a smug grin permanently etched onto his face. He found Mrs. Sterling near the champagne tower, her neck draped in diamonds that sparkled almost as brightly as the smartphone she was currently holding up to show a group of wealthy socialites. Oh, you simply must see the video, Mrs. Sterling cooed, her voice a sharp, performative trill. Mr. Chen was an absolute hero. He handled that vagrant with such firm authority. It's just so refreshing to see someone taking our neighborhood's safety seriously. You wouldn't believe the nerve of some people, thinking they can just sit on our sidewalks and ruin the view. She swiped through her screen, the footage of Julian being soaked with mop water playing on a loop as the small crowd chuckled behind their manicured hands. Chen joined the circle, basking in the praise. It's a matter of standards, Mrs. Sterling, he said, puffing out his chest. If we don't demand excellence, we succumb to the gutter. I've always said that success is a filter. It keeps the quality in and the trash out. Tonight is a celebration of that filter. He looked around the room, feeling invincible. He had the mayor in the corner, the city's top food critics at the bar, and the most influential developers in the state sipping his vintage wine. In his mind, he had reached the summit, and the beggar he had humiliated was nothing more than a ghost, a faded memory of a minor annoyance. Suddenly, the heavy rhythm of the party was interrupted by the low, guttural roar of high-performance engines echoing from the street below. Guests began to migrate toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, their curiosity piqued. A fleet of 5 identical, obsidian black Rolls-Royces pulled up to the curb, moving with a synchronized grace that demanded attention. They didn't park at the valet. They stopped directly on the red carpet, blocking the entrance entirely. The room fell into a confused silence as the lead car door was opened by a chauffeur in crisp white gloves. A man stepped out, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. He was dressed in a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with surgical precision. His hair was perfectly styled, and his presence radiated a quiet, terrifying authority that made the room feel small. It was the beggar. It was Julian Vance. As Julian walked through the gold-rimmed doors of the restaurant, the air seemed to leave the room. He didn't look like a man who had ever spent a night on the concrete. He looked like the man who had invented the city. Mr. Chen's champagne glass slipped from his hand, the sound of it shattering against the marble floor like a gunshot in the silent room. Mrs. Sterling's phone captured it all. but her hand was shaking so violently that the frame was a blur. Julian didn't stop to greet the mayor or the critics. He walked with a steady, predatory stride directly toward the center of the room, stopping inches away from Chen. The contrast was staggering. The restaurant owner looked like a frantic child in an oversized suit, while Julian stood like a mountain. "I believe I told you to be careful which bridges you burn, Mr. Chen," Julian said, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom with the weight of a judge's gavel. "But it seems you were too busy polishing your cuffs to listen." Chen's face had turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Julian's face, then at the expensive fabric of his suit, then back to the eyes he had mocked only days ago. The realization was a slow-moving train wreck. Julian turned to the room, his gaze sweeping over the socialites and the politicians who had laughed at the video only moments before. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of a grand reopening, Julian announced, his voice now commanding and cold. "But it appears there has been a slight change in the programming. You see, the person you've been celebrating isn't the host of this party. He's just a man who forgot that even the tallest towers need a solid foundation." The atmosphere shifted from festive to funereal in an instant. The guests shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the man they had been praising seconds ago. Julian leaned in closer to Chen, his whisper loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The gala is over, Chen. And so is your lease." The silence in the grand ballroom of the Jade Pavilion was no longer respectful, it was suffocating. Mr. Chen stood paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically from Julian's polished leather shoes up to the cold, diamond-sharp clarity in the man's gaze. He tried to speak, his throat working convulsively, but only a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze escaped his lips. The guests, including the high-powered city officials Chen had spent months courting, began to back away as if he were suddenly radioactive. Julian reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, folded piece of cardboard. It was the torn half of the "anything helps" sign that Chen had thrown into a puddle days before. He placed it gently on the gold-leafed bar next to a bottle of vintage champagne. "You told the police I was a thief, Chen," Julian said, his voice echoing with a calm, terrifying resonance that commanded every ear in the room. "You told this city I was a stain on the sidewalk. But while you were busy filming your little videos for social media, my team was doing something much more productive. They were finalizing the acquisition of Vance Plaza." Julian gestured to the massive digital displays at the front of the room, which usually looped artistic shots of the restaurant's signature dishes. With a click from a remote held by Marcus, who had just entered the room, the screens flickered. The entire gala watched in stunned silence as high-definition footage played, not of food, but of the restaurant's own back alley. The timestamp was from the morning of the arrest. The room watched as Mark the chef leaned over a tattered backpack, carefully hiding a bottle of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, while Chen stood nearby, checking his watch and nodding with a smirk. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Mrs. Sterling, who had been holding her phone up to record the scandalous Beggar, slowly lowered her hand, her face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. She tried to slip toward the exit, but the crowd was too dense, and the weight of Julian's gaze seemed to pin her to the spot. "The truth is a funny thing, Chen," Julian continued, stepping closer until he was towering over the shaking man. "It doesn't care about your silk ties or your Michelin stars. It doesn't care how many followers you have. It only cares about who you are when you think no one is looking. And tonight, the whole world is looking." Chen finally found his voice, though it was thin and cracked with desperation. "Julian, Mr. Vance, please, I didn't know. It was a mistake. We can talk about this in private. The lease, we can work out a new deal. I've put my life into this place." He reached out to grab Julian's sleeve, but Julian stepped back with a look of such profound distaste that Chen's hand dropped as if burned. "There is no deal," Julian said, his voice turning into a gavel of finality. "You didn't just insult a man on the street. You insulted the very idea of human dignity. You treated a human being like trash because you thought he had no power to fight back. But you forgot one thing. I didn't build my empire by being weak. I built it by recognizing value where others see nothing. Julian turned to the two uniformed officers who had just entered the back of the room, the same officers who had handcuffed him days earlier. This time, however, they weren't looking at the man in the hoodie. They were walking straight toward the man in the velvet tuxedo. "Mr. Chen, you are under arrest for filing a false police report and evidence tampering," the lead officer said, his voice flat and professional. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the very same sound that had signaled Julian's humiliation, the room erupted into a flurry of whispers and camera flashes. Mark the chef was led out a side door in zip ties, his face white with terror. Chen began to sob, his knees buckling as he was led past the long line of billionaires and celebrities who were already deleting his contact information from their phones. Julian stood at the center of the wreckage of Chen's ego, the "anything helps" sign still resting on the bar. He didn't look happy, he looked weary, the weight of the lesson he had forced himself to learn pressing down on him. He looked at the mayor, who was awkwardly trying to adjust his collar. "The party is over," Julian announced to the room, his voice soft but absolute. "But for the people who actually make this city run, the ones you walk past every day without a glance, for them, things are just getting started." He turned and walked toward the exit, his silhouette framed against the glass doors of the empire he now owned, leaving the shattered remains of Mr. Chen's world behind him in the dust. The flashbulbs and the sirens eventually faded into the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of a city that never stops moving. In the weeks following the gala, the fall of Mr. Chen was as swift as it was absolute. His bank accounts were frozen, his reputation was incinerated in the court of public opinion, and his Michelin stars were stripped away like cheap stickers. The Jade Pavilion didn't just close, it transformed. Julian Vance stood across the street, watching as the gold-lettered sign was carefully removed, replaced by a simple, elegant plaque that read the Elena Vance Community Kitchen. It wasn't a place for the elite to be seen, it was a place for the hungry to be fed. Julian was no longer wearing the bespoke tuxedo or the tattered hoodie. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets as he watched the first group of guests enter the building. Sarah stood at the entrance, her face glowing with a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. As the new operations manager, she didn't just manage a staff, she managed a sanctuary. She caught Julian's eye from across the street and offered a small, knowing wave, a silent acknowledgement that the dry towel she had once offered him had changed the course of her life forever. Julian's late wife, Elena, would have loved this. He could almost feel her presence in the warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, a reminder that true wealth isn't held in a vault, but in the lives we touch. 5 years passed with the quiet inevitability of the tide. The financial district had changed, becoming a place where the lines between the powerful and the forgotten had begun to blur with a newfound empathy. On a particularly brisk November afternoon, Julian, now older and with silver hair catching the sunlight, walked down the same block with his young grandson, Leo. They stopped at the corner where Julian had once sat with his cardboard sign. A man was sitting there now, his back against the cold brick, his face lined with the deep, jagged furrows of a life gone wrong. It was Chen. He looked decades older, his skin sallow and his eyes clouded with a weary, permanent shame. He held a small cup, his hands shaking with a tremor that no silk tie could ever hide. Julian stopped, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. There was no mockery in Julian's gaze, no smug satisfaction at the sight of his former tormentor's ruin. Instead, there was only a profound, quiet sadness. Julian reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a gold coin or a business card. He handed Leo a warm, wrapped sandwich from a nearby deli and a small card with the address of the community kitchen. Leo walked over with the innocence only a child possesses and placed the food into Chen's lap. Chen looked at the boy, then at the man standing a few feet away. He didn't say a word, but a single tear tracked through the grime on his cheek as he clutched the sandwich like it was the most precious thing he had ever touched. "Why did we help him, Grandpa?" Leo asked as they continued their walk toward the park. Julian squeezed the boy's hand, looking back one last time at the man on the corner. The cycle of cruelty had been broken, replaced by something far more enduring. He thought about the boardrooms, the penthouses, and the cold nights on the concrete. He thought about how easy it was to judge a person by the rags they wore or the titles they carried, and how dangerous that illusion truly was. Because, Leo, Julian said, his voice soft and steady, everyone deserves to be seen, even when they've spent their lives trying to make others invisible. We don't help people because of who they are. We help them because of who we are. True character isn't how you act when you're sitting at the top of the world. It's how you reach down to the people still climbing. Never judge a book by its cover, because you never know when you might become a character in someone else's story of redemption. Remember that kindness is the only currency that never loses its value. As they disappeared into the crowd, the sun set behind the Vance Community Center, casting a long, golden shadow over a street that had finally learned the meaning of grace.